house. My name is Denis Maksimov. I'm the curator of exhibitions and public programming here. And we're excited to welcome today Ian Christie, professor of film and media studies in Birkbeck, and the long-standing friend, you could say, of the house and the Russian culture, and maybe one of the main experts on the history of Russian and Soviet cinema as well. So we're very excited to hear today him speak and present the new publication, which will also include the presentation of the film. And after the presentation as well and the conversation afterwards, we'll be able to continue the dialogue in the bar as well. So reserve the questions and the conversations both for the formal part and informal part too. So over, some booze. So without the further ado, Jan, thank you so much for having us and for presenting your work.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Denis. Very nice to be here. I didn't think that we would ever manage to bring this off, because I should perhaps say that there was an original plan some years ago to try to do an exhibition about FEKS, which we decided mutually that it was not a good time to be doing it. So for me, right, for me this is like a prophecy coming true in a reduced form. But it's important that it does happen, I think, because I felt very strongly back in 2020 that the centenary of Eccentrism, of FEKS, should be celebrated. And I know Yelena felt the same. Here we are, despite all the obstacles that have been placed in our way. So what I'm going to do is, what I produced is a book. And that's got a history too. You can move to the next slide. And the history of that is, a few of you may know, this is a pamphlet that we produced at the BFI back in 1978, when nobody knew anything about FEKS and Eccentrism, including me. So I was learning on the job with the help of some people who did know more than me. We produced this, and it accompanied a season of eccentrist films at the NFT, back in the days when the National Film Theatre did programs like that. And we were able, eventually, to bring the surviving member of the group, Leonid Trauberg, to London. And that, for us, I think for everybody who met him, was a great experience. So what I'm going to show you is a little bit of background on that history, and then some video, both of Trauberg in London in '83, and a new interview that we've made, that Roland Denning, who's not able to be here tonight, made with Kevin Brownlow, who was really the person in London that Trauberg wanted most to meet. Unfortunately, Kevin has the same glowing memory of it, and you'll hear him describe what actually happened in his own inimitable way. Right, let's go on to the next slide. So, the dates of this are becoming a little bit hazy in my mind, and I can't get absolute clarity about it, but essentially, we showed New Babylon at the end of '82. I'm fairly sure. I can't actually find the date. We did 3 shows at the Queen Elizabeth Hall with amazing success. We could have lost our shirt, but actually the audiences came, and for the first time, the Shostakovich music, the original score, was synchronized with the film. There's been much controversy about what is the correct synchronization, etc., but I'm pretty sure that the version that we did put on at the end of '82 was substantially correct. That's a picture from a recent performance in Berlin, the Berlin Babylon Orchestra. It's been done a number of times by different people in different performing editions, and there is still some controversy about the synchronization, but that's understandable. Trauberg wasn't actually present in London for the screenings, but he came via the Netherlands, where he'd been invited by Theo van Houten, where they had done some shows as well. And he came to London after it, riding on the tide of the success of New Babylon, which was a revelation to everybody. So much so that the BBC, can you believe this? The BBC said, we'll buy it. And they recorded it and transmitted it with an introduction by Lindsay Anderson, no less. I believe I've found somebody who's got a video, an off-air video of that, which would be nice to have. Next slide, please. So Leonid came for, I think, about 10 days or so, and he met lots of people. I introduced him to Ivan Montagu, who was actually near the end of his life at this time. I don't think they had known each other previously. Montagu, of course, had been in Moscow very often, but I don't think they were close. But they had a lot to talk about. That's a picture taken at the NFT of them reminiscing. And as I said, Leonid wanted to meet Kevin. Why did he want to meet Kevin? Because he knew the parade's gone by. He said he'd read it 11 times. And he remembered almost every chapter of it. And he was asking Kevin about particular aspects, details that had struck him. So he was absolutely the ideal, this was the ideal meeting. And you'll hear Kevin describing what the meeting was like. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons why Leonid wanted to meet Kevin was that he had become really a very prolific author in his late years. He'd produced lots of books, I think 5 in all, or maybe 6. There's a 2-volume selected writings. The typical Soviet style was everybody who lived to a ripe old age got to do their volume of, collected or selected works. Leonid did 2 volumes. But much more importantly for him, he produced, and this is what he was really enthusiastic about, he produced this, The World Inside Out, which is really a very unusual book in Soviet terms. I mean, you can see the layout of it. It's got extraordinary end papers, and it's very much an enthusiastic history of the silent period in American cinema, written with enormous brio, enormous enthusiasm. He says in the dedication, all my adult life I've been a film director. It's a wonderful profession, and happy are those who devote themselves to it. Next slide, please. In reality, of course, Trauberg had actually been prevented from being a director in the whole later part of his life. The last film he directed was, appropriately, a Gogol adaptation, an adaptation of Dead Souls, which has been very little seen. I haven't managed to track down a copy of it. That's particularly important, given the importance of Gogol to Kozintsev and Trauberg. But he had a second career after he was pushed out of filmmaking and pushed out of Leningrad and had come to Moscow. His second career was to teach on this slightly mysterious film school, the higher courses, the film school that nobody talks about. Yes, the best. By all accounts, absolutely the best. The best people taught on it, and it produced many important filmmakers, including Panfilov. And I think, according to Leonid, Panfilov was sadly no longer with us. Panfilov was perhaps the filmmaker that they were proudest of having produced. So he had been a teacher. When that came to an end, he decided to devote himself to writing. And he wrote with enormous brio, enthusiasm, and diligence. And not only is this a very good history, as far as I can tell, but he also produced, next slide, please. I think we've got more on the next. Well, no, let's go back before we come forward, just for those who, no, go to the next slide here. Let's do a little bit of background first. No. On to the next slide. That's it, yeah. For those who might be not familiar with the background, and I think looking around, many of you will know this, but this is a quick catch-up. So the FEKS group, I think there's a slide before that, isn't there? Let's go back. Okay, right, well. Kozintsev and Trauberg came together in what was then Petrograd in 1919 or 1920. There's a lot of uncertainty about precise dates, but they both arrived from Kyiv and Odesa, respectively. And this is from the article, essay that Shklovsky wrote in the 1928 anthology about FEKS. Shklovsky was an early enthusiast. He took to what the FEKS group were doing. He promoted them enthusiastically, and he wrote this wonderfully evocative piece, which I think is one of the most evocative, it comes from this little book, one of the most evocative accounts of what Petrograd was like in 1921, which is when they started operating. I just think it's a magical evocation of the period. And what he says, of course, in it is, there was a FEKS poster in 4 languages frozen to the wall. And that is probably the poster he's referring to. As you can see, it was a feature of all the FEKS, early FEKS material, that they were happy to do their posters, their performances in 2 or 3 languages. And it was really important to have English in there too. Next slide, please. So, young Kozintsev and young Trauberg. There's even a mystery about their dates. Trauberg keeps correcting the date. His mother apparently falsified his birth date to prevent him the danger of him being called up, and that confusion has persisted. What has also been less noticed, I think, and I think is really important, is that there were actually 3 central figures in the FEKS group to begin with, and the third one was Yutkevich. And Yutkevich remained a good friend of Trauberg's right to the end. They were still very much seeing each other all the time. They were very much in cahoots. Not that Trauberg approved of Yutkevich's later films. He definitely didn't, but he said, he is my oldest friend. And I remember going to a screening with him at the House of Veterans, where they showed one of Yutkevich's last films, Lenin in Paris. And Trauberg said, I don't know why he made this film. I think he just wanted to go to Paris. It's not a very good film, but the bond between them was extraordinary. And I attended several screenings with them of other films, and it was really important to them. And of course, the 4th member of the group, who thought very hard about joining them, was Eisenstein. Eisenstein, who'd been grown up in Petrograd, essentially, before he went to Moscow, or before he was in the Red Army, was uncertain whether he should base himself in Moscow or in Petrograd. And he certainly came for an important summer. 22, he came for the summer back to Petrograd, and he thought about staying with them. And that's a very interesting thought. What if he had stayed and become an actual part of the 4-person group? But he didn't. He went back to Moscow, and the rest is history. Next slide, please. There's a bit of uncertainty about just what constitutes the Eccentric Manifesto. When we published this booklet back in 78, we thought that we had the manifesto, no problem. We thought it was 1922, and Richard Taylor translated it. We then discovered much more recently, and really only about 7 or 8 years ago, I think, that in fact that's not the original manifesto. It's a second manifesto. The first manifesto was probably produced for that famous 5th of December event in the comedy theatre, the Free Comedy Theatre, and it's much shorter. And it's got a number of significant differences which are recorded in the new booklet I've done. So basically they expanded it enormously. The 1922 collection is called Eccentrism 1922, as you can see. And that's what we'd always taken to be the manifesto, but in fact it's a considered expanded version with a chapter by Yutkevich, rather interesting chapter by Yutkevich added to it, which had not been part of the original. But this is typical FEKS style. This is one of the 3 or 4 posters they produced. As you can see, it's a blast of multilingual, nailing their colors to the mast. Problem for non-Russian readers is understanding all the references that are going on in it. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this new edition is to give non-Russian readers access to just how funny, witty, and referential it is. Next slide, please. So take this pair of pages. What we've done in the book is to reprint the 1922 manifesto with a new, updated, revised translation. So you can actually kind of get into the detail. Originally, we never thought to translate the interpolations, the ads which appear in the original, but they're fascinating. Look at this. This is an ad for a screening of Secrets of New York and The Mask That Laughs. Nobody knew that there were enthusiasts for that. Next slide, please. And what is Secrets of New York? Well, Secrets of New York turns out to be Exploits of Elaine. Was it an old copy that had been kept? Or had somebody somehow managed to get a new copy of this by now very old serial? They were obviously very enthusiastic about it. All of the Pathé and Hearst serials from 1914 onwards had actually been very, very popular in Russia. They'd all been retitled in Russia. They all got fabulous posters. You can see one of the posters up there on the left. And there was a vigorous following for them. Kozintsev and Trauberg very much belonged to the generation who grew up on those serials, loved them, knew them very well. But you have to know the translation to know exactly which serial they're referring to. Next slide, please. Trauberg and Eisenstein were both, as I say, devout admirers of Fantômas. Not only the films, maybe not even the films, so much as the novels, the yellow-covered novels, which were highly prized. Trauberg wrote a piece near the end of his life in 1989, which he sent me, which I'm just in the process of trying to translate, in which he talks very engagingly about a lifelong rivalry with Eisenstein over who had the maximum number of Fantômas novels. It's very funny, it's very affectionate. They kept trying to borrow the others. And basically, Trauberg was really proud of having all 30 later in his career, which was really quite a feat. He was a great bibliophile, and he included Fantômas amongst his enthusiasms. So that, I think, tells us this text, which, as I say, I've been working through, really tells us an awful lot about the relationship between Eisenstein and Trauberg. It's not a simple relationship of having almost been working together in the 1920s. It's a more complicated relationship. We do know that Trauberg was publicly critical of Eisenstein at a crucial moment in 1935, as were many people. But we also know, I think, from this late text that they remained on very good terms. And clearly it was a relationship that continued to the end of Eisenstein's life. And of course, Eisenstein borrowed their cameraman. Ivan the Terrible would not be the film it is if they hadn't got Moskvin from FEKS, who shot it. Next slide, please. There's a lot. In a sense, we know more about Kozintsev than we know about Trauberg, or have known about Trauberg, because Kozintsev went on to a second career as a highly respected director of the Shakespeare films, of Hamlet and King Lear, and also of Don Quixote. And he published a lot of essays. Trauberg has never really been properly brought to light for an English-speaking audience, or indeed for any audience, I think. There was a conference in Moscow in '89, which I took part in, and there was an exhibition, a display mounted for it, and I photographed this, which is probably Trauberg's earliest script. I'm glad I did, because I've no idea how we'd get access to it again, but there it is. And talking to Trauberg and doing a bit of research on it, I realized that it's actually largely inspired by this very strange English novel, The Brass Bottle. Anybody read it? Not a well-known novel, but it was very popular in Penguin. And it's an Arabian Nights story about the genie that escapes from the bottle and wreaks havoc. So Trauberg was really already he was an enthusiast for that kind of Edwardian fantasy literature. He knew it backwards. Most of it, I think, was translated into Russian. I think he would have initially, of course, got it from Russian translations, but then his English got better and better, and he was clearly reading a lot in English. He became a friend of P.G. Woodhouse's, for instance, by correspondence and all sorts of things like that. To understand these strange early stage shows they did, the original Gogol, Not the Wedding, and this very mysterious one, Foreign Trade on the Eiffel Tower, you really have to dig into sources like this, and I think that's work that is ongoing as far as I'm concerned. But we have this illustration of one of the costumes, and that was done by Yutkevich, so he was clearly cooperating with them through this period quite closely. Yutkevich, of course, was primarily perhaps an artist and was designing and doing a lot of visual work at this time before he actually got a chance to start making films himself. Next slide, please. After Foreign Trade in the Eiffel Tower, Kozintsev and Trauberg decided that they were going to forget theatre. That was the old life, and they were going to dive into film. They wrote a script, Edison's Woman, deeply unfilmable, but we have a summary of it. It would have been very hard to do. Then they wrote The Adventures of Oktyabrina, and they got the go-ahead from what was becoming Len Film to make it. They were supposed to be assistants. A director was appointed. They pushed the director off it, and they directed it. And that led to Oktyabrina. The film is lost. Not, I think, for any sinister reasons, but it seems impossible that any version of it will turn up. All we have are about, I think, 17 or 18 stills. But there's plenty of evidence from the journals of the time that it was really popular, possibly more popular than the strike. The strike and Oktyabrina came out at the same time. And I'm not trying to make value judgments. We know the strike because it eventually got released very much later, and nobody had seen it until the 1960s when it was first began to be shown. So we've become very familiar with the strike. But if you understand that Oktyabrina and the strike were made more or less in parallel, then I think it makes more sense of some aspects of the strike. Exactly what Oktyabrina was like, we can only guess, but look at this picture. That's the famous, well, a famous group photograph of the team who made Oktyabrina. If you decipher the large poster at the back, you discover it's for the Hawks Trail. So they're still very much wanting to display their loyalty to the American serial tradition. And I think that's really quite significant. I only realized this a year or so ago, that there's a lot of evidence you can pick up from material like that. Next slide, please. That's 2/3 of the surviving images from Oktyabrina, including these famous ones of the dancer who played Oktyabrina, Zinaida Tarkovskaya, who was in fact a very prominent dancer. There are a lot of graphic illustrations of her. She appeared in a lot of things. She even took part in some Kuleshov test filming. And she was very close to some of the leading choreographers of the time. She decided to stay, and Trauberg said rather ruefully that he wondered if appearing in Oktyabrina hadn't damaged her career as a leading ballerina. We don't know. It's a very lively film. I'm not going to... what I've done here, and it's in the book, is I've tried to match the synopsis of the script to the images that survive, so that you get a sense of how it went. You can look at that at your leisure. Next slide, please. So for those, again, this is something which many of you will know, Glumov's diary, but this was Eisenstein's first venture into making film. And remember something, this is all over the internet now, but remember, nobody had seen this until very recently. It was only discovered in 1977 in Krasnogorsk. It was discovered by accident in the documentary archive, tagged onto the end of a Dziga Vertov film. Vertov had stuck it on the end because it was using his film stock, and he had to demonstrate that the film stock had been used. Stuck on the end. Somebody realized that it was not Vertov. Vertov stormed off after the first few hours of shooting and left Eisenstein to it. Have a look at this. This is the Morozov mansion, of course, in Moscow. Still, I think, largely intact. That's Alexandrov playing Volodkin. But the whole episode, this whole episode, of course, is very much modeled on the American cliffhanger serials that Eisenstein loved as much as Trauberg and Kozintsev, with Alexandrov doing some very dangerous things. But all built around this stunt. And unfortunately, someone who I was hoping to be here tonight isn't able to come, Phil Cavendish, in his wonderful, wonderful essay on Glumov's diary, has explained what's really going on in this sequence. It's a fabulous piece of work, some very, very good research. So this, the premise of this little filmed insert for the stage production is that Glumov's diary has been made on film. So it's, you know, the man who left his will on film, the man who put his diary on film. These are all the members of Eisenstein's troupe, the Prolet Cult troupe. And it's full of stop-action gags. Very similar, I think, to the tone that we would have found in Oktyabrina. So I think it's really time to sort of start looking at this as something made pretty much, made actually slightly before Oktyabrina, but I think it's the closest we'll get to that sense of doing gags with elaborate costumes, wildly improbable activities, and lots of stop action, simple special effects. And this is Yanukova, whom Naum Kleman is convinced that it was the reason for the animosity between Vertov and Eisenstein was over Yanukova. I'm not sure I'm totally convinced, but he is absolutely convinced that they were both in love with Yanukova. Anyway, next slide, please. Okay, no, that's it. So the earliest, they made another film in between, but the first film of the FEKS group that we have, substantially complete, although it's not totally complete, is The Devil's Wheel. Problem with The Devil's Wheel, there are many problems with it, but one problem is that the term Devil's Wheel means nothing in English, but it means the same thing in every other language. It means one of these revolving platters where people spin off. And if you put Devil's Wheel into Google, you get 1 million pictures of them in Germany. It's still a very popular activity in Germany, people spinning off the wheel. Unknown in Britain, as far, to me anyway, and I think to most people. So it would have been a very common reference. And what's interesting is that the fairground that you see in The Devil's Wheel, the place where Sobolevsky and Semyonova meet up on a night out in the town, was actually Luna Park in Petrograd. Well, by now it was becoming Leningrad. And so the film was shot in Luna Park, which had recently closed. And it's a, I know some of you will know the film. It's an amazing film because it has a kind of picture of what people got up to at night around Petrograd, Leningrad. It's a vision of popular culture and of a date between these two characters, the sailor who has jumped ship from the Aurora, the cruiser Aurora, and the woman he meets. And they have a night together, and then they eventually they call in the police to clear out some of the reprobates who are still lurking in the side streets and old tenements of Leningrad. Next slide, please. They then made, again, some of you will know this, they made essentially 3 big films. There was another lost film, Little Brother, which looks absolutely amazing, and which Shklovsky clearly thought something of, but that's disappeared. The 3 that survive, more or less intact, are The Overcoat, SVD, or The Society of the Great Cause, their first historical film set in the period of the Decembrist Revolt, and of course New Babylon, which has become by far their best known film. None of these is really in very good shape. No serious restoration has been done on any of their films. So compared with the work that has been done even on Eisenstein, there's a lot of mileage to make up, and it's very difficult to actually find showable copies of any of these films. Probably The Overcoat is in the best condition because it has literary status, but even that's not great. I'm not going to talk about these now because I'm sure many of you know them, or at least know The Overcoat and New Babylon. Next slide, please. The beginning of celebrating FEKS is this booklet in 1928, which had a very substantial print run. And clearly there was enough enthusiasm, to publish a collection about their work. I don't think there were many other early Soviet filmmakers who had a volume dedicated to them. And possibly it was Shklovsky's enthusiasm, his is the first essay, that got it published. I'm not sure. But much more interestingly, and I only discovered this really through David Robinson. David Robinson has been collecting these Kino Plakat little booklets for years, quietly. He has a large collection of them, and there were dozens of them. And they're little typical early Soviet era publications, cheap paper, very short, etc., but with a massive tirage, with a huge print run. It's 25,000. So there is a demand. And again, I've done a rough translation of this. It's an extraordinarily insightful account of Griffith. Trauberg knew his Griffith, and he scrupulously says, the very first page has a footnote saying, the transliteration isn't right. This is not how you pronounce his name, but it's the way we do it in Russian. Griffith. He has seen almost all the films, and he records information which he's not certain about, but can be checked. It's a very scholarly publication. He made that while they were making The Devil's Wheel. He wrote this during that time. It's hard to credit that level of industry and precision. So in a sense, his career as a writer about cinema really began very early indeed, and I think deserves to be known. I think this may be the first book on Griffith anywhere. Who knew? So, next slide, please. So now for a rest from me and a little bit of others speaking. So what I've done together, I'm planning to turn this into a more substantial film about FEKS and about Trauberg. So this is really work towards that. And I just want to show you 2 of the components that will eventually, I hope, form part of it. One is an interview which Roland Denning and I just made 10 days ago with Kevin Brownlow. You don't want to wait too long for these things. It's important to get elder statesmen while they're still with us. And Kevin was very pleased to come and talk about his memories of Trauberg. What you'll see in it is a little odd, because it's Kevin reading his account of the meeting, which we filmed just to have it. That'll be voiceover, of course. And then you have Kevin talking about his memories of actually meeting Trauberg, followed by the only surviving copy, as far as I can tell, of a 1983 interview that I made with Trauberg. I was working on the original Channel 4 film program, Visions. We had a camera crew downtown. I borrowed a room in the Canadian High Commission, sat Trauberg down, and we did this interview with him, which has never been used until Roland Denning used it in a TV program produced by Tariq Ali, about New Babylon and the Paris Commune. There's only a VHS of it. It's got time code embedded. I haven't looked into removing the time code yet, but it gives you a sense of Trauberg as he was in what was still very much his prime, I think, in 1983, reminiscing in response to my questions. So let's have the video.
Leonid Trauberg had not yet arrived, but a sprinkling of people were there, including a BBC man who spoke Russian. I expected an interpreter, but when Ian Christie brought Leonid Trauberg in, there was no one else. I was delighted when he recognized my name and said, "Kevin Brownlow, I know your book as well. I have read it 11 times. I was just using the chapter of Griffith for my work. I am very pleased to meet you." He said he particularly loved the William Wellman story, When He Cry. Great scene for a play, great writing. His English was fair. When Charles Cooper was introduced to him, he said, "My English, Mr. Cooper, is a killer." Now, other people had to be introduced. I sneaked towards the sandwiches, where Andrew Udell told me that the Dutch had brought him over. Then John Gillett went up to Anthony Smith and gently directed him towards making a little speech of welcome. The Russians like that. So he did, mostly dull stuff about how the BFI would like to see exchanges with Russian film people. Eventually, Leonid Trauberg said, "In my youth, I had many pleasures, I confess it. In my old age," he looked as though he was going to say how few he has, "I also have many pleasures, and one is to come to British Film Institute." Shortest Soviet speech on record, said someone. I sneaked past, and Cooper was still rabbiting on about how he wanted Russian films in their original language. He did not want a Georgian film dubbed into Russian, but in its original Georgian, referring to Piroshmani. At one point, Leonid Trauberg said he had seen The Colour of Pomegranates to Anthony Smith, quote, "I did not understand the montage or how it was made, but it was poetry." Leonid Trauberg was small with a bright expression, gleaming dark eyes. He looked like a marmoset. Eventually, I got his attention, and he began to talk about his early days. My age, I came to pictures in 1923. He actually said 23rd. That was FEKS. I was very young, 21. Kozintsev, he was 19. No, nearer 18. Our love for the cinema was from youth, very early childhood. The cinema was Landare. Our love was for many pictures, for pictures from everywhere came to our country. D.W. Griffith, Chaplin, Woman of Paris, DeMille, Ince. It was wonderful, like a water fountain to us. Also German films. These were very interesting, but not in our line. Very mystic, very strange in decor and lighting. Fascinating, but not for us. But they influenced us. They began us playing with light. Anyway, in one day, we realized the theater is not for us. Cinema is tempo, is people. He was the most marvelous Russian to meet under those circumstances. I was sorry that we had a rather posh flat at the time in Belsize Park, but he didn't seem to notice. He was just fascinated by the film objects, Hitchcock's camera from 1925 and things like that. he was seemed to be a tremendous enthusiast. It would have been very easy to have worked with him as a young man. Very lovable character. I'm very fond of him. And we did keep in touch by correspondence for a while. And he gave me a splendid interview, as he evidently did to you too.
It is known history, but for me it is marvel that people knows about this, because our group, FEKS, was little group with no importance, and our first film was short and not so good, but comic, gay, and our actors are our actors, not professional actors from theater. The sense of revolution are in these films, and this is why we like it, these films. And our group is now give many men to cinema, and I am very happy that 60 years ago, Kozintsev and I began the FEKS. That is page in history of cinema. I must again say, not so good page, but not so bad.
What was the reaction to your early films by the critics? Did critics respond to them?
Very different. We have enemies, many enemies. They said, oh, that is formalism, that is abracadabra, that is not good realistic cinema. And many others, they said, no, it is very interesting. They us, must work, and we worked. That was love for us. When we work it in cinema, we must work it from morning to evening and perhaps to next morning without declination. That is enthusiasm, perhaps. And I am enthusiast of cinema now. I am very glad that you can perform this film for Londoners. I like England very much. I am fanatic of English literature. I am fanatic of English films of Richardson, Anderson, Lowes, Lester, and many others. I like London as I like Leningrad. I think that our group was the most united group. Moskvin, Yenei, Kozintsev, and me, and our actors are one thing, one man. And Shostakovich, when he comes, he was with us. He made 10 films for us. 10 films, that is not usual. Because he sensed that we are united group, united. I wrote the book about D.W. Griffith. And when I wrote it, I was inspired by many books of American in English authors. The book of Kevin Brownlow, the book of many others, scholars. And I love from my youth the comic leaders of silent cinema, but not as biographical material, but because of their philosophy. My book named The Old Inside Out, because I think that Chaplin, Sennett, Keaton, and Lloyd also, and Marx Brothers also, they came to the world ironically, like many people's folklore, like works of Lewis Carroll, Edward Lear, like burlesque, like Mark Twain and Lawrence Stern. And I wrote a book about the chain of the literature, of theater and cinema leaders in 20s. After the 20s, we found pictures, they died. Good films. I must say that I like not only Soviet film, because I am man of cinema, I am man of my country, but in the cinema is product of our century.
Go back to the slides. So that gives you a flavor of just how cogent Trauberg could be. And you know, this is, as I say, in 82 or 83, but I'm certain about the date. This is the book that was in press that he's talking about, showed you earlier. That's the book he's referring to. But he wrote also this book, which is a more personal book about the actors who appeared in the early FEKS films, with 8 and 1, which is a little joke on 8.5. He was very up to date with recent films because he was living in Moscow by this time. He had left Leningrad under a cloud because he had been denounced in Pravda as the leader of the Cosmopolitans in 1949. And he had immediately been dropped by the studio, dropped by everybody. People wouldn't talk to him. It was awful. And I think he contemplated suicide, as a number of people did at that time. And Vera, his wife, managed to pull him together and said that they must move to Moscow and start a new life, which they did substantially. Well, I think we're going to hear a lot more about this inner life, the things that happened, because it turns out that there is a diary, not a precise volume, but a large collection of diary-like writings. An American researcher has had access to this, and I've been in contact with her. I've read the outline of the book that she's proposed, which will be published, and I think we get a lot of insight into what happened as Trauberg thought about it later during the 1980s, and I think it's going to be a really interesting insight. We're going to learn a great deal more about it, but basically he became a survivor, and he became a mainstay of Dom Kino in Moscow, and Dom Kino was the center of film culture in Moscow during the 1970s and 1980s, and all the Western films were shown there. So he was really very well versed in Western cinema, which was always an enthusiasm of his, even as he was writing about his own early period. If you want to look at the program that Roland made for Tariq Ali's Rear Window series, that's it online. You just put in Rear Window Paris Commune and it'll take you straight to it. And there's another bit of Trauberg's interview talking about the making of New Babylon. I think it's a very good program. Made very simply, part of a series that Tariq Ali produced for Venezuelan television. It's very strange. It seems to exist in both Spanish and English, and the series was apparently financed by a number of Latin American countries, including Venezuela. So there we are. But it exists and it's online. I hope you find the book interesting. What I've done is not try to get ahead of myself, but to really present the best version of the texts that we have, newly revised by Richard Taylor, who was very keen to get back to it, updated with a few additions and extra pieces, and a piece that's never appeared, I think, since its first appearance. It's a text by Eisenstein. You would have thought that every scrap of Eisenstein has been published, but there is a short essay called My First Film, which David Robinson translated for a very old book, and I've reprinted that as well. And I think the focus of what I've tried to do is to really focus on the period from 1920, 21 through to New Babylon, because I think that's a very exciting period. I'm not saying that the films of the 30s aren't interesting, but that can come later. So that's all I've got to show you. If anybody's got any questions that I might be able to answer, very happy to do that. Thank you. We thought we'd let this run. This is just a very bad copy of, just in the background, in case you haven't seen The Devil's Wheel. This is the scene where they meet Mr. Question Mark, played by Gerasimov, who is a sinister magician. But, I mean, we don't have to run it, but if you want to watch it. Yes.
I don't know anything about this, Ian, but I'm caught on the word actor. I'm not quite sure why they put the word actor in the title of this organization, if you call it that. And I think Trauberg mentioned Stanislavski, and I'm wondering if the whole thing is somehow a response to Stanislavski. And was Griffith not an actor originally? I think so. I'm just, is this something you can talk about? I mean, were they acting? Were they performing their own films?
It's a very good point, actually. It's worth commenting on. They opened a kind of, they ran courses. This was a very popular thing to do in the early 1920s. Well, actually, even in the late teens. Everybody, all over the world, people were offering courses in this newfangled thing, cinema. There were courses in script writing, there were courses in acting for film and directing and so forth. I just learned recently that Khanjonkov, who was the great Russian producer of the teens, opened a film school in Istanbul when he briefly emigrated before going back to Moscow. So it was a very popular thing to do. That's what FEKS did. Kozintsev and Trauberg ran courses in performing for film. So they called their outfit Factory of the Eccentric Actor. And that became their trademark, FEKS, even though they were, of course, doing much more than acting. It's kind of similar to what Meyerhold was doing in Moscow with his biomechanics. Meyerhold was running an acting course, as we know, which has become very famous. There are lots of photographs of it, teaching people biomechanics for the kinds of productions that he was doing. That's become hugely famous. There's not much documentation of what the FEKS group were teaching, but they were certainly running courses. We have the ads.
But was there was a recent book about the method. I can't remember the name of it. And there's the opening 100 pages is just a history of Stanislavski. And maybe I'm overstating it, but in Moscow at the time, was Stanislavski, I mean, was he a known quantity in terms? Okay.
Stanislavski is the other lot, as it were. He's the Moscow Art Theatre. And what Stanislavski was practicing in the art theatre and in its school was teaching what later became known as method acting, very naturalistic, intensely naturalistic. What Meyerhold was teaching and what the FEKS group were teaching was anti-naturalistic, performative, circus-inspired, music hall-inspired, but the absolute opposite of the art theatre. A quick anecdote: Trauberg, during one of my visits to him in Moscow, he said, "I'll get you tickets for the art theatre," which were difficult to get. So he got 2 tickets for Tartuffe, it was, with a really starry cast. And we went towards the theatre, and he handed me the tickets, and I said, "But we're going together." He said, "Nope, I cannot." Because apparently he was on his way to MKHAT, to the Moscow Art Theatre, the day that he opened Pravda, and discovered that he had been denounced. And that had always, as he said, he could never contemplate going to the art theatre with equanimity after that. So I stood on the steps, waving a ticket saying, "Anybody like a ticket for Tartuffe?" And a large circle of people formed, and a woman pushed her daughter forward and said, "You speak English, you speak English." So I had a delightful young Russian woman accompany me through the performance of Mahat, thanks to Leonid. He was very amused by the story when I told him.
Hi. I was just wondering to what extent the philosophy kind of underpinning FEKS could be formalized, and I was thinking about the use of gags and the similarity to Dada and Surrealism, and obviously with those kind of movements, they were very much a kind of movement responding to the First World War and kind of the bourgeois kind of way of life, and they were very subversive. But I appreciate perhaps this was a more kind of functional, practical approach as well in terms of acting and style. But yeah, how much was there a kind of philosophy that was expressed underpinning it?
Well, I mean, just to say something briefly about that, when you read the manifesto, both the first version and the better-known second version, one name keeps turning up, and that's Marinetti. And so I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which this is the kind of Futurism, Russian style, carried forward. What's interesting is that the first version of the manifesto obviously holds Marinetti in some esteem. The second version calls him a madman. And so really the tide had turned against Marinetti in Russia. He'd been tremendously important. He came to Russia, gave lots of speeches, was a big influence back in the early teens. And then I think people realized that he wasn't so great, but his influence was definitely there. And so all of Marinetti's recipes for disrupting convention in all media were applied. And I think if we had the early FEKS films, they would be a form of futurist performance. I mean, essentially, I think that would be, there's that, and then there's this Gogolian, what they were trying to do in a sense was to channel Gogol, as they understood Gogol, into a 20th century version. And so the very first spectacle they did, they called electrified Gogol. But they were mixing genres. In the first show that they did, they projected a bit of Chaplin. They got some Chaplin film from a projectionist and projected it in the background. Not diegetically connected with the show at all, but just because they wanted to have some Chaplin as part of the mix, as it were. So it was a kind of collage. But very eclectic, very jokey. And the last thing to say maybe is very much against the prevailing theatre culture of Petersburg. The manifesto is riddled with digs at the academic theatre. And if there's one consistent thing, it's a kind of constant, attacking and making fun of the great stars of Petersburg, Petrograd theatre, who they felt were pompous and out of touch and so forth. So they were really trying to blow that up.
Thank you. So this is all completely new to me, but I'm really interested in. It's fascinating. Thank you. And what you said about futurism and made me wonder: are there any links with Lev Luntz, who in 1923 made this incredible screenplay that never got made because then he died? But the dates and St. Petersburg and even the links with Odessa, I just wonder. I wonder if there's any links with Lev Luntz.
I think it's part of the climate of the times, and I think that's where Shklovsky comes in quite a bit too, and his Serapion brothers, which I'm sure many of you know perhaps. So Shklovsky was sort of curating a group of young writers, avant-garde writers, etc. And Luntz was part of that, I think. And basically, I think it was very much under Shklovsky's patronage that there was this explosion of interest in experimental writing and experimental film. And of course, that's why he took to them. So he's very much the godfather and is kind of keeping alive this Eccentrism in a climate which, of course, is becoming increasingly, will become increasingly hostile to it. And Eisenstein only gets to do the crazy things he does in The Old and the New and October because of Potemkin, because he's kind of won his spurs with Potemkin, which has become the most internationally seen film. And that gives him license to get away with Blue Murder until the shutters come down. and I think the other thing, of course, that which is interesting is that Leningrad is getting away with a lot of things that you couldn't do in Moscow. And that's a whole subject in itself, what you could get away with because the spotlight had moved to Moscow. Moscow was where serious things were happening. That's where all the film and theatre activity was happening. And so it was much easier to practice avant-garde activity. And I think that's what FEKS did. FEKS managed to keep on doing it right through to New Babylon, which is a completely avant-garde work. It's music and as a film, right until 1929, at a time when Eisenstein was having terrible difficulty doing the same in Moscow. So it's a combination of factors, yeah. Climate of the times.
Thank you. Some short questions. I didn't catch everything Trauberg said, but I think he said that Shostakovich had worked on 10 of their films. So, I mean, do we have those scores from looking at Shostakovich's work? And two even shorter questions. Does your book have nice pictures, and how much is it?
The pictures aren't bad. I've tried my best. But I have to say that a lot of them, I mean, it's been very difficult, obviously. This has not been done with cooperation from Russia, because when we got into serious production, it had become impossible to engage with people. And I had to drop contacts, unfortunately, with, for instance, Kozintsev's son, Alexander Kozintsev, who is a delightful, wonderful person with whom I was having a vigorous correspondence and really learning a lot. He's an anthropologist, very distinguished anthropologist, but we had to break off contact, unfortunately. And this book will never circulate in Russia because it starts off with a denunciation of Putin and ends with a denunciation of Putin. So it ain't going anywhere there. The question of Shostakovich is interesting because he was very close to them. They bought him his first piano, they always said. He was younger than them. And he'd been playing piano in cinemas to make money. And he wrote the score for New Babylon, which is an early masterpiece, completely not experimental, but it is an experimental score at a time when this was not being done by anybody else. He then went on to collaborate on all their films during the 1930s. And then he also collaborated on Kozintsev's solo films after the partnership dissolved in 1946. They fell out. Well, they didn't fall out. The film Poor People, Plain People, was denounced. The partnership fell apart. It seems fairly clear that Kozintsev dropped Trauberg. Trauberg was the problem. They were both Jewish, so it wasn't just because Trauberg was Jewish, which he always put on his passport. He described his nationality in Soviet times as Jewish, which you could do. But it wasn't just because he was Jewish. There was clearly a falling out between them. And what has become clear from what I've seen of the later diary is that Trauberg felt very wounded by Kozintsev dropping him. But Shostakovich continued to work with Kozintsev. No reason why he shouldn't, and of course he contributed wonderful scores to the later Kozintsev films. So that's why there's such a string of films. But he worked on the trilogy that they made, the Maxim trilogy in the 1930s, which is a wonderful series of films. Those all got Shostakovich scores, and he worked on their experimental first sound film, Alone, Odna, which is very interesting, and that's been kind of reconstructed to some extent. Partly live performance, partly the film as we have it. So it was an ongoing partnership. Vera Trauberg told me that when Trauberg was denounced, Shostakovich wouldn't talk to him anymore because he was scared. He was scared of contamination, and she said, I remember her saying to me, "Can you imagine it? These two old men living in the same apartment block, and Shostakovich wouldn't speak to Trauberg." It was a time of great fear. I mean, I don't think we should be judgmental about anything. We've never lived under circumstances like that. But apparently there was a note found under the door. She also told me a note had been pushed under the door, which was not found at the time. So there's even more to that story. None of this has been really adequately chronicled. We know so much more about Eisenstein and... that is late 40s, it's early 50s, it's 49, the cosmopolitanism scandal and the expulsion of Trauberg.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was fantastic, and I think it's brilliant that we're all here celebrating FEKS. I was very inspired. I saw the film and the orchestra in 1983 that you mentioned, Queen Elizabeth I, which is amazing. And years later, sorry, this is a bit of a plug, but in 1996, we formed, with a group of us, the new factory of the Eccentric Actor. And so we are a theatre company, and we've been going ever since, and we do stuff. And one of the shows we did was a version of New Babylon. Yes. And our latest show is a celebration of 100 years using the manifesto, the Eccentric Manifesto, which I now understand is the second manifesto. So we'll have to do another one. So we have actually performed here in the past, so maybe we could perform that here as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Wonderful to hear. Thank you. Yeah. Good to know the spirit lives on.
Hi, this might be a silly question, but at the beginning of your presentation, you talked a lot about the importance of like using 3 languages in all of their, produced books and things like that. And I'm noticing as we're watching these, films through that they're actually only using Russian on here. Why did they not extend that, I guess, multilingualism to their films?
This is, you can see it comes off Russian. Sorry, it comes off Russian television. Somebody's recorded it off air. This is just the standard Goss film font. This is this is one of the great images. I think it's pure new wave. Semyonova and Sobolyevsky on the what are known as Russian mountains on the roller coaster. So it's that's just the standard typography that the Russian archive used for processing, for modernizing old films. We have no idea what the original titles looked like because they've all been got rid of. And so every Soviet film of the 20s and the 30s and so forth has the same style of titles. It just was imposed on them. It would be fascinating to know. Nobody, I think, ever asked at the time, what was the typography like. It probably was very different and might well have been multilingual. Using American, as they saw it, English, was a very, very important gesture by a lot of Soviet artists of the 1920s, as I'm sure many of you know. I mean, America was modernization. America was kicking against traditional imperial Russia. And it was not seen as in any way, it wasn't, in a sense it wasn't political, except in the sense that it was about modernity and the future. So that's why there's so much English. And they adopted as their slogan, better to be, what is it? It comes from Mark Twain. I've forgotten it. Can you remember it, Julian? Better to be a something than a something. And you look at it, and then you a young pup. Yes. So I looked up Mark Twain, and he doesn't say that, of course. So we did a bit of research on that and discovered that actually the original Russian translation of the Mark Twain, yes, remember? Yes, the original is a June bug, or a May bug, or something like that. And the translator must have said, we don't have those in Russia, let's make it something else. But young pup is so much better. So they found a wonderful translation. Right.
So we can continue the conversation over the drinks in the bar in a more festive atmosphere. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to welcome you at the other events at Pushkin House. Thank you very much.